He was a simple mechanic, the kind of man the city barely noticed. A narrow shop squeezed between a laundromat and a bakery, a faded sign, a bench scarred by years of work. His hands told the story, short, blunt nails rimmed with grease, small scars knobby at the knuckles, wrists tapered by hours of lifting and turning. He moved through noise and traffic with the same steady, quiet rhythm he used on his bench. For 20 years, he fixed wheelchairs for free. The first time came by accident. It was late, rain steady on the sidewalk, and a young woman waited under the bakery awning with a wheelchair that had stopped leaning toward life. One caster wobbled like a loose tooth. Another wheel rubbed and hissed. The woman's face was patient and tired in a way that looked like waiting a lot. Sam, because that's what people eventually called him, though no one ever asked where the name started, had been sweeping up at the end of the day when she rolled up with a folded blanket on her lap and asked if he could look. He could have said no. He could have pointed to the posted hourly rate or to the parts in the back that were earmarked for the next job. Instead, he took the wheelchair into the glow of his work lamp, wiped the rain from a worn seat fabric, tightened a bolt with an old wrench, and fashioned a spacer from a strip of aluminum that had been meant for something else. The wheel turned the way wheels are supposed to turn. The woman smiled, small and unexpected, and left with more ease than she had arrived. That single act didn't make headlines. It barely made a dent in Sam's day. But like a pebble dropped into a still pond, the motion rippled outward. Word passed along sidewalks and through city service calls. There is a man behind the bakery who will fix a wheelchair. People arrived with everything from squeaking casters to frames bent in accidents, and Sam met them the way he met any other machine, methodically, with patience and respect. He asked about the fit. He listened when someone explained how the chair failed to get them down a curb or into a bus. He worked until midnight when he had to, and he charged nothing. If this story is finding you, and you like discovering quiet people whose actions quietly change a neighborhood, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Sam's life before the wheelchairs was ordinary in the way that matters most. He worked. He came home. He lived above the shop for years, bed pushed under the eaves, a kettle that whistled on the stove, a small radio he used to fall asleep by. Some nights his daughter, when she was younger, would come down to the bench and hand him a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper. He kept a photo tacked near the grease-stained lamp of a boy with a crooked grin, the kind of small claim to belonging that steadied him. What changed was the smallness of each repair. Fix one caster one night, another bolt the next week. At first it was a hobby-level kindness, the sort that can fit into a person's spare time. Then the spare time began to vanish. Customers with cars still paid. Those without any reliable income did not, or they could only pay in gratitude. Sam found himself cutting into his Sundays, skipping overtime that might have brought in extra cash, learning the particularities of chairs, tilt-in space frames, the idiosyncrasy of a worn, quick-release axle. He read manuals between patients. He learned how to make a part out of scrap when the original would cost more than the chair was worth. Along the way, he assembled a patchwork ledger in the back of a notebook, little notes in the margins. Mrs. Alvarez, caster tightened, Omar, wrist strap replaced, needs cushion. A list that became his way of keeping people and their needs in his head. He knew the names, the stories, gently. A veteran who had lost a job after shifting to part-time hours. A college student who used a wheelchair to get across campus and could not miss a semester because a wheel squealed. A mother who juggled daycare and school and could not afford a mechanic's bill. Each repair was a small rescue. A return to daily life rather than an act of charity that stripped away independence. That mattered to Sam. He fixed equipment that allowed people to show up for their own lives. There were moments, many of them, when the kindness felt like a strain. Parts cost money. Some chairs needed welds that required time and a delicate touch. Sam's own toolbox sometimes showed it. A broken spring here, a spur of rust there. He wore out shoes walking home from the junkyard for a needed bearing. Once, a landlord called to complain because Sam's late nights made the building noisy. He lost shifts because he'd taken on a long repair that stretched into morning. Yet, almost without fail, on the other side of each small cost was the sight of someone who could go to a job interview or take their child to school or simply leave the house. 3 small lives illustrate the shape of this work. There was Marcus, an aging veteran who came in with a chair that leant to one side like an old ship listing. Marcus had once been proud of uniforms and medals. Over time, pride had given way to small indignities. A bus driver who refused to help him board, a step too high for a ramp that wasn't there. Sam straightened the frame and fashioned a brace, speaking to Marcus like a human being first, man later. When Marcus rolled out of the shop, his shoulders were lighter. "I can go to the vet center now," he said, voice flat with relief, and later his son told Sam that Marcus had reconnected with old friends because he could finally make the trip. There was Aisha, a single mother who taught evening classes at a community center. Her chair rattled in the way that betrayed a loose axle, and in her bag were graded papers and the kind of determination that didn't ask for pity. She arrived at Sam's door after a long day of teaching and childcare. He adjusted the axle, wrapped the frame in weatherproof tape where a seam had split, and sent her off with instructions and a promise to check back in. Weeks later, she returned with a thermos and 2 cookies, insisting he take them. Aisha later helped by organizing a small repair drive, recruiting a classmate to donate a gently used cushion to someone who needed it more. And there was Jonas, a university student whose scholarship depended on his ability to attend classes across a hilly campus. His overly cheap chair had a habit of slipping forward on inclines. Sam reworked the brakes, and on quieter nights, taught Jonas how to tighten the cables himself. Years after, Jonas came back, not as a recipient, but as a volunteer, bringing with him soldering skills and a calm voice for new volunteers. Around the 10th year, the work shifted from quiet gesture to sustained project, without a ceremony to mark the change. People started arriving from further corners of the city. The list in Sam's back pocket grew. He moved from fixing single bolts to evaluating entire chairs, teaching caregivers how to maintain parts, and scavenging components from donated chairs that could be cannibalized to fix others. He experimented with makeshift cushions cut from old upholstery and held informal classes on how to keep tires inflated and bearings clean. The bench became a classroom, the late hours an informal clinic. Even so, there were nights of doubt. Once, he sat on the back steps after a day that had eaten his energy, 2 long fixes, a walk to the parts store, a call from his landlord about the rent. He thumbed through the back of his notebook until a page about suspending work fluttered loose and sank into the gutter. He thought of closing up, of tending to his own life for a while and letting those who could pay handle repairs. But the next morning, a woman arrived with a child who needed a minor adjustment. The child's relief when the chair rolled straight was like a small radio that had turned on. Sam couldn't walk away. Sometimes the strain was practical. There were limits to what a one-man shop could do. Heavy-duty power wheelchairs with complex electronics were beyond his toolkit. He referred those onto clinics and smaller programs when he could. But most everyday wheelchairs, the ones whose maintenance had been neglected, responded to steady hands and ingenuity. Sam kept a small, zippered pouch of parts that he had collected over the years. Spare casters of varying diameters, a handful of nuts and bolts, a selection of tires. People started bringing him frames that were technically beyond repair, and leaving with a chair that was at least safe enough to get down a curb. He never billed them. Word spread in the way quiet things spread. Neighbor to neighbor, direct phone calls, a message left at the community center. It spread not through press releases, but through the steady, lived reality of someone getting where they needed to go, because a wheel turned true. Over time, his clients began to refuse to accept the arrangement as a private service. They insisted on giving back in ways that didn't involve money. Some chipped in time, some offered baked goods, some provided the kind of human companionship that is valuable in a city where loneliness is loud. A turning point arrived not through a dramatic exposé, but at a small dinner. One of the people Sam had helped, the veteran Marcus, organized a modest gathering at a church hall. At first, Sam refused to attend. He felt awkward being thanked for something he considered part of being a neighbor. But Marcus was insistent. The room was not large. People sat in a circle with folding chairs and took turns sharing brief fragments. How a repaired wheel had gotten them to a medical appointment, how a replaced cushion had saved a sore back, how a child had learned to roll to the playground after a cracked axle was fixed. When it was Sam's turn, he said, "I didn't do it because I wanted to be thanked. I did it because I kept seeing someone stop living their life for lack of a small part." He shrugged, hands folded in his lap, and then, under the murmur of the room, someone stood and said simply, "You didn't have to, but you did. That matters." That gathering became the seed for something more deliberate. The people Sam had helped decided they wanted to create a place where repairs were not an afterthought or an unpaid favor, but a sustained community resource. They began quietly. A few people pooled money from yard sales and card tables. Others volunteered tools and a borrowed van. Someone with a legal background read the fine print on permits. Another with carpentry skills offered to build workbenches. The group moved carefully, worried about taking something that had been a private kindness and making it into an institution that might lose the intimacy that made it work. They wanted dignity, not charity. When the neighborhood finally organized a proper space, a modest storefront with a ramp and a scuffed sign, Sam wasn't immediately convinced he needed it. He had been reluctant to shift from the back room to a public clinic. Secrecy had been part of his ethic. He liked helping people in an unassuming way, the small anonymity of a late-night fix. But the new place offered more than recognition. It offered tools he couldn't afford, a volunteer base, a steady schedule so people could count on service, and a small fund to purchase parts. More importantly, it offered employment and training for people who had once been clients. Former clients became staff. Marcus taught skipping and tightening to new volunteers, his voice patient and confident. Aisha coordinated appointment slots and outreach to community centers, so people in distant neighborhoods could be guided to the clinic. Jonas handled basic electronics for powered chairs and taught young volunteers how to solder and code simple diagnostic tools. That reciprocity, people who had once relied on a stranger becoming the people who kept the system alive, was the heart of the transformation. The workshop didn't end Sam's private acts. It amplified them. He continued to come in, partly out of habit, partly because he still loved the work itself. The click of a bearing seating, the small satisfaction that comes from seeing a wheel swing true. But he was no longer alone. There were quiet weekends when a line of people waited. There were scheduled classes on maintenance, and occasionally the kind of public support campaigns that raised enough money to buy original replacement parts rather than jury-rigging a solution. The clinic began partnering with a local health center to teach caregivers simple preventative maintenance. Over time, their model became something the neighborhood could sustain, a combination of volunteer labor, small grants, and community donations. No one claimed a miracle, just persistent, organized care. One afternoon, years after that first midnight fix, a young journalist came by to write about the project with the headline already in her mind: "The mechanic who saved the city one wheel at a time." She interviewed Sam and the volunteers and sat through a repair demonstration. What surprised her, and what carried through the piece, was not the size of the operation, but the daily ethic. How a single man's small decision had reoriented a neighborhood's sense of responsibility. Sam downplayed it. He spoke in short sentences about nuts and torque, about how sometimes the best part of work is simply listening to someone explain how their mobility had been eroded bit by bit. The journalist listened and wrote about the many hands involved. The veterans, the students, the mothers, the volunteers who had learned to weld. The reveal changed things. Not because people suddenly decided to enter Sam's shop, but because it formalized a shared commitment. City officials came by to see the clinic. Neighbors who had never met before donated folded linens and spare blankets. A local business loaned space for a storage shed. The real change, though, came from individuals who had been on the margins and who now stood up to help others. A former client who had once been housebound now guided wheelchair-bound neighbors to medical appointments. A trained volunteer started a small program teaching basic repairs to caregivers of rural communities. The secret network turned into an overt community. Sam, ever the modest man, would say little about legacy. If asked, he would point to the bench where he had first learned to read a wheel for what it needed. "It's not about me," he would say, and mean it. For him, legacy was more concrete. The benches carved from old pallets, the tiny clinic library with repair manuals and diagrams, the kids who now learned a skill that could feed a family or simply help a neighbor. He kept the notebook, its spine frayed, and in a margin there was a list that now read like a map. People who knew to come when a tire needed air, who knew to check the bearings before the winter rains. There were times when the clinic's work touched lives in ways that echoed beyond the obvious. A man who had been unable to stand long enough to apply for a job found a position in a small warehouse because his chair, now reliable, allowed him to get there on time every day. A teenage girl could, for the first time, go to a summer camp because her chair was repaired and a parent felt safe. Not all of these were dramatic shifts. Most were accumulation. Fewer missed appointments, more reliable school attendance, the relief of fewer breakdowns on slick streets. Still, the story refused to be tidy. There were limits and failures. Some chairs were too old, some funding dried up, and the clinic sometimes had to turn people away or refer them to clinical specialists. Sam had disagreements with volunteers over priorities. Small tensions about who needed the most urgent help could sting. There were nights when the clinic ran out of parts and Sam drove across the city to scrounge a needed bolt or to pick up a donated frame. Those nights reminded everyone that kindness, even when institutionalized, often relies on improvisation and stubbornness. In the small ritual of the clinic's 10th anniversary, marked by no ribbon-cutting so much as a community potluck, people shared the truth of what had been built. Speakers were brief. A nurse who had referred dozens of patients, a volunteer who had learned to weld, a young woman who had been able to finish school because of reliable mobility. Sam, older in ways only his hands could tell, sat at the back and watched. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "Fix the thing so a person can live." People laughed and nodded, because they knew him well enough to know that was as eloquent as he got. The clinic continued. It became part of the neighborhood's furniture. It offered scheduled repair hours, a small emergency fund, and volunteer training. It developed a modest sustainability plan, bake sales and community fundraisers, partnerships with local nonprofits that could provide heavier-duty parts, and a small endowment built from small, steady donations. Importantly, the clinic insisted on a dignity-first approach. Clients scheduled appointments and called ahead. They were treated as customers who had agency, not as clients of charity. The larger question the story asks is deceptively simple. What starts as one person's small, persistent act can grow into something that outlives them, but only if it invites others in. Sam invited in silence for years, but once the community stepped forward, the project gained scale without losing intimacy. His quiet ethic spread because he did not require a parade for his work. He only required that people be seen and that their mobility be respected. Toward the end of his time behind the bench, when his hair had more silver and the bench a few more gouges, Sam would sometimes sit back and watch a volunteer tighten a bolt with the same careful motion he had taught. He found satisfaction in small, sturdy things. A wheel that turned true, a child who could chase a bubble without fear of a wheel collapsing, a veteran who could attend a small reunion. He did not want to be called a hero. He preferred to be called a neighbor. What can each of us do with a story like this? The invitation isn't to replicate Sam's exact work, unless you have the skills and time, but to consider the smallest service you might reliably offer someone nearby. Could you tighten a bolt? Could you lend a hand to a caregiver? Could you organize a neighborhood tool drive or help a local clinic with outreach? Small, consistent acts, repairs, listening, time, compound. Perhaps the most important lesson is this. Dignity often comes in the form of ordinary competence. Fixing a chair is not a grand gesture. It is the restoration of daily life. The repaired wheel is not a cure. It is access. The person who uses that wheelchair is not defined by that moment. They are enabled to participate, work, education, family life, in the ways everyone else can. Respect looks like that quiet labor. The screwdriver turned where it matters. If you are moved by how a neighborhood turned a private kindness into a shared resource, consider supporting local mobility programs in your area. Many community clinics, adaptive sports groups, and independent workshops accept donations of parts, volunteer time, or small funds to help purchase original components. Or start small. Ask a neighbor if they need help with something practical that restores independence. A wheel, a ramp, an extra pair of hands for a doctor's appointment. The smallest action, repeated, builds something that lasts. At the end of the day, when the shop light goes out and the city settles, you can still picture Sam's hands, greased, sure, and the way they turned a wheel back toward the world. That is the kind of kindness that quietly changes a city. Not a headline, but a habit. What is one practical thing you could do this week to help someone keep moving? Who in your corner of the world needs a small, steady repair to show up fully for their life? See them. Care enough to act. Start with one small thing, and keep at it.